And Bruce, you can take it away.
Great, thank you, Sasha. I'm going to try and live up to your fine sense of pulling everyone together. It's great to see so many faces up on the screen of people near and far in the city, some colleagues with slightly longer hair than the last time I got a chance to see them. And of course, many kind friends and followers of our guest speaker today, who is Joan Neuberger, a professor of history at UT Austin. Joan is, of course, the best kind of speaker we try to have with us at the Jordan Center because she is both someone who is excellent at talking to scholars, but also civilians. She is a very distinguished and well-known name in the world of public culture in Russian and Soviet worlds of the 20th century. But she is also just as well, if not better known to her many fans of her blogs and websites and podcasts, of which she has been frequently the founder, the editor, the director, perhaps most prominently of one of the sites she founded, Not Even Past, which many of us have been following for years. If it's not something you've checked out, I would really encourage you to do so. Our guest today received her BA from Cornell College once upon a time and went on to get an MA and a PhD from Stanford University before eventually settling into her current position in Texas. She is very well known for her first book on hooliganism, crime, culture, and power in St. Petersburg from 1900 to 1914. And without narrating too much on her behalf, it is not long after that that her CV suggests that she made a decided turn, although one can see signs of that in that first book. There it is, thanks to Jane Burbank up on the screen sharing the book. That Joan made a decided turn into studies of visual culture across the Soviet 20th century, which of course takes us into not just her excellent companion monograph on Ivan the Terrible, which came out in 2003, but the extraordinary dedication she's given to the world of Sergei Eisenstein since, and in a wonderfully collaborative way for those of us who have just been following her work, enormously collaborative with a number of scholars around the globe, and particularly, of course, the great Naum Kleiman, who has been such a captain of Eisenstein studies. It has been among the many reasons to invite Joan for today is her wonderful book with a luminous title, This Thing of Darkness, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible and Stalin's Russia. Those of you who have been circling the world of Joan in recent months know that it has been nominated for many prizes, including the Pushkin Prize in the UK, which is still not quite resolved. We're still keeping fingers crossed for that. It, of course, already earned the honorable mention for the Vucinich Prize, which is the very top prize that's given every year in Slavic studies. But it was just this past week for any of us who grew up reading the fantastic works of the historian George Mossey. It really was very sentimental to me to see Joan take the George Mossey Prize from the American Historical Association. Formally, this is for work in the intellectual and cultural history of Europe. So this is one of many reasons to be glad to see our speaker today. She is, in theory, a virtual fellow at the National Humanities Center this year in North Carolina, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe she is beaming into us from her couch in Austin, Texas. So I will stop, but I hope that everyone will just join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest. The title of the talk today is Sergei Eisenstein and Immersion in Nature. So please, Joan.
I am, okay, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. Bruce, thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And I also just want to add that all prizes are great, but winning a prize named after George Mossey also has an incredible extra meaning for me and so many people, it turns out. I've gotten messages from his students going back to the 70s who just are still so attached to him. And so that's for good reason. So it's especially nice. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see, even though you're only little tiny boxes, it's still really nice to see a lot of you who I don't get to see often enough. I'm gonna put some pictures on the screen and turn myself into a little box. And mostly I'm doing this because I'm going to be reading a number of quotes, and I think it's just easier to kind of see them while I'm reading. Okay, that looks good. Everyone settled? Okay, well, okay, so let me start by saying that this is a relatively new project for me. So I'm really looking forward to any and all suggestions and comments and questions. Of course, I've been working on Eisenstein forever, but working on nature turns out to be an entirely different, well, actually similar in some ways to working on Eisenstein. Eisenstein's just huge. There's a huge literature about him. He was a graphomaniac, and it turns out that nature is a huge subject itself, which I didn't realize when I started going down this road. Maybe I should have known that, but I didn't. So the main thing that I'm investigating is the role of nature and the experience of immersion in nature in Eisenstein's work, really throughout his career, but especially in the second and the later half of his career. And my overall argument is that this is an extremely important part of his writing that hasn't been appreciated really. That it played a central and unappreciated role in his thinking about cinema, about montage, about the production and reception of art, of all the arts, and also about the politics of the arts and about politics more generally. And I believe that immersion in nature, the whole notion of nature in his writing helps us answer some questions that are still controversial, having to do with his film theory and also just sort of the trajectory of his thinking over the course of his life. So I won't be covering all of that today. Today, I'm really just going to be talking about nature and immersion in nature in Eisenstein's thinking. And if there's time, I'll come back and talk about some of the politics as well, but I'm not quite sure how much time we're going to have. Okay, so two pieces of context first. Eisenstein is still often pigeonholed as the revolutionary filmmaker of Battleship Potemkin and the inventor, the developer of Montage, and that and pigeonholed as someone who didn't really do much of importance after that. Obviously, I don't agree with that. In fact, he was constantly revising his ideas about Montage, and some of which I addressed in my book about Ivan the Terrible. But there's really a lot more to say. Eisenstein specialists themselves are still somewhat divided over the trajectory of his career. There are those who believe that there was, going back to David Bordwell, who sort of established this as an idea, going back to Bordwell, who famously saw a major shift in his thinking from the dialectics of collision towards something that's more organic, more rather than constructed, and a shift away from images that, contrasting images colliding with each other towards opposites, various concepts of opposites that could merge rather than collide, as in his earlier, more violent, emphatic ideas. So I want to say that I'm not alone in saying this, but I see Eisenstein's ideas as developing more as a process of accretion rather than a shift, and that he saw montage and immersion as complementary rather than different from each other, rather than mutually exclusive. And I think his nature writing is one of the keys to understanding this whole aspect of his work. And then the second, some theoretical context. So as I said, writing, maybe you all know this, but writing about nature is huge. If you go back to keywords, which I think is a really excellent place to start any project, Raymond Williams said that any study, that a full study of nature would include something like half of all of human thought. That's a lot, but it's undergone, nature writing's undergone a major shift since about the 1980s. And there's now a vast literature that has appeared to examine landscape, nature, the environment, the Anthropocene, the human, the counter-humanist interactions with nature. And this literature places those relationships and those representations in a social, cultural, and political context that was missing from earlier art history and naturalist writing. The pioneers, Dennis Cosgrove in geography, Simon Schama in history, Raymond Williams and literary scholars and art historians who contributed to W.J.T. Mitchell's anthology on landscape and power, They all explored the ways that nature is constructed, represented, and experienced in social and political terms. Eisenstein anticipated some of this literature, and he departed significantly from some of it. His view of nature stood in direct opposition to these authors' focus on modernization, both capitalist and communist, that saw nature as something to be dominated or managed, and that saw representations of landscape as contributing to those projects of social engineering. Eisenstein rejected this literature's concept of the human gaze as a detached, disembodied, colonializing, modernizing male gaze. In contrast, he really anticipated the next generation of literature on landscape and nature that recognized nature's own power over us and interaction with us. But while these historians in the sort of second generation proceed from a conception of an embodied multisensory experience of nature and the construction of culture and memory based on acknowledging the perspectives of things like rocks and rivers and animals who live alongside us, they still fundamentally focus on human agency. Now, Eisenstein's Dialectic of Nature, both as experiences and as representations, is rooted in our ability to dissolve into, to literally transfigure into elements of the natural world. Now, this is, of course, a commonplace in American Indigenous culture and many others, but is new to the sort of academic study of nature. Nature serves human needs in Eisenstein, but it has its own terms, its own time, its own shape, and its own agency. So on to Eisenstein. We're going to start in the spring of 1945. The chaos of war was winding down and turning into the chaos of the post-war. And Eisenstein was in the middle of finishing Ivan the Terrible Part 2 when he wrote an essay called The Music of Landscape and the Fate of Montage Counterpoint at a New Stage. And this is the title page from his archive. Sometimes this whole essay is referred to as non-indifferent nature, as you can see here. But sometimes it's just seen as the second half of the book that we have as called non-indifferent nature, which is how he also planned it. This was a time, though, when dominant ideas about nature were like those I just described, that were saw nature as indifferent, inert, passive, there to be mastered, controlled, improved, and exploited. Eisenstein was writing about nature as something that shapes us, that we live with, that we can embody, something that we dissolve into, something that is us and that we are. In The Music of Landscape, he tells us that during the war, while he was in evacuation in Alma-Ata, he rewatched Battleship Potemkin in order to, because he was still teaching students there, in order to prepare a class for students. He was struck by the extraordinary functions that landscape and music shared in silent films. Their ability to represent the embodied experience of nature and their ability to convey and evoke feelings in viewers. Images of landscape were free from the burden of explicating character, free from storytelling altogether. So landscape, as we have shown, is least of all a catalog of trees, lakes, and mountaintops. Landscape is a complex bearer or carrier of the possibilities for a plastic interpretation of the emotions. Most scholarly attention to this essay has focused on these passages about the sensory, nonverbal experience of nature that landscape shared with music. But for Eisenstein, this sensory, emotional, invisible, and idealist was always in a productive dialectical tension with the rational, the narrative, and the materialist. And we see this in the dialectic in The Music of Landscape, in the way that Eisenstein treats landscape as a plastic object, an object that does the work of materializing and making visible such immaterial and invisible entities as thoughts and emotions. In fact, he saw landscape as the consummate object for exploring the central dialectic in cinema, painting, fiction, poetry, and so on. In this 1945 essay, Eisenstein did not see nature as inert or passive, as a passive object on which humans project their feelings or insert their consciousness. He saw this relationship of a dialectical opposition between entities of equal aliveness and equal agency. This view of nature as a thing that human beings both use for their own ends and merge into or submit to entirely is at the center of the music of landscape. And in fact, non-indifferent nature generally can be seen as primarily about the ways we living, breathing, thinking, feeling beings interact with things outside ourselves. Eisenstein's primary question was always, how does a film or any work of art best convey the artist's ideas and feelings to the viewer? And here, Eisenstein thought that landscape, both in nature and on screen, was especially good at this. Landscape, he thought, can convey, landscape can convey feelings like music, not because we project ourselves onto it, or not only because of projection, I'll come back to that, but because human beings can immerse themselves in nature. Everywhere, this was the emotional landscape, dissolving human beings, or more precisely, everywhere the emotional landscape turns out to be an image of mutual absorption of human and nature into one another. In this way, landscape, he wrote, is largely a portrait and very often a self-portrait that dissolves the human into itself. A number of scholars, Anne Nesbitt, Yuri Tsivian, Mikhail Yomhovsky, and others have read this dissolution as a sacrifice of subjectivity, as a total disintegration of the self, and as the death that precedes resurrection and life, the death that's necessary to life. And these are all common tropes in all of Eisenstein's writing. It's this death that's necessary to life is one of the savage junctures that animates the title of Anne's book and that animates so much of Eisenstein's work. Nesbitt has also shown that one of Eisenstein's sources for the figure dissolving into the landscape and then emerging from it originated in Eisenstein's reading of Biely's book on Gogol. And she writes that Gogol's landscapes, or she shows that Biely claimed that Gogol's landscapes produce the figures that inhabit them. But it turns out that Biely's Gogol was actually only one of Eisenstein's sources. Another major source for this understanding was his writing about ancient Chinese landscape painting and its representation of yin-yang oppositions and interpenetrations. Whoops, I'm going to come back to that, actually. That's supposed to be next. The immersion, and this is another quote from Non-Indifferent Nature, which refers to a whole discussion about ancient Chinese landscape painting. This immersion into the self, into the great nothing, which at the same time gives birth to everything, is of course basically an imagistic, obrazная, interpretation of that exalted state that seizes every person when they remain completely alone with nature. In such moments, they're seized by an unusual feeling, as if a dissolution in nature and a merger with it. And in this feeling, it feels like a removal of the contradictions between the universe and the individual, usually opposing each other, just as humans oppose the landscape. Moreover, we especially experience this feeling not only in its early pantheistic form, but in its highest and most perfect form on the social stages of development. This is what the feeling of merging with the collective and merging with class is like. I left that part out of this because I'm not really sure I'm going to have time to talk about the politics, but Eisenstein connected this immersion in nature with the immersion of the individual in a kind of authentic collective, which he saw as the opposite of the Stalinist collective. In other words, it turns out, as we see in this quote, that this dialectic of nothing, or the death that leads to life, on the one hand, and everything that gives birth to life, is actually intimately related to something even more fundamental and profound, if you can imagine something more fundamental and profound than life and death, and that is the dissolution into nature, this merger of the self and the landscape. This was so fundamental for Eisenstein that he sees it as the origins of all dialectics as well. And then in typical Eisenstein fashion, he goes on to elaborate all the ways that he could find that a variety of early modern and modern writers, thinkers, and painters depicted and wrote about this dissolution into landscape. And of course, he finds scores of examples. Here's Georges Sand. There are moments when I crawl out of myself, when I live in vegetation, when I feel like the grass, the birds, the top of a tree, a cloud, running water, the horizon, a flower, form and feelings, changing, transforming, indistinct. Moments when I run, fly, swim, drink the dew, spread out in the sun, sleep under the foliage, fly with the swallows, crawl with the lizards, twinkle with the stars and the planets, and when I, in short, live in what composes the milieu of evolution, seeming to appear as the extension of one's own being. And here's Guy de Maupassant. I think, sir, that I am quite open, that everything enters into me, forces me to cry or gnash my teeth. Well now, when I look at the slope opposite us, at this large green fold, at the hordes of trees climbing up the mountain, the whole forest in my eyes, it penetrates all of me. It seizes me. It flows in my blood. And I even think I'm eating it, that it fills my insides. I myself have become the forest. In Eisenstein's memoirs, he talks about, oh, that's what this is. Whoops, let's go back. In Eisenstein's memoirs, this is a scene from Strike, which a lot of you know. He refers to this kind of thinking as his passion for the mutability of forms. If these artists can reproduce that mutation of form in their work, they will have affected what Eisenstein calls the self-portraiture in landscape. And he goes on to give, I'm not going to go into this right now, he goes on to give the perfect example of this, which is El Greco, one of his favorite painters. But in other words, the self-portrait isn't just a self-projection onto nature. It's nature entering the self, and then the artist being able to represent that experience in words or in paint or in images. And this in turn is what allows readers or viewers to immerse them in Eisenstein's thinking, allows readers or viewers to themselves immerse themselves in the work and join with the author, the artist, and feel a sense of the artist's purpose. So Eisenstein's at pains to distinguish this immersion, this mutual absorption of human and nature into one another, from human projection onto nature. And this is the point when actually going back to that picture of the that image of the man turning into a wolf, especially when I present this to historians, not literary or film scholars, when people usually come up and ask me, does Eisenstein really believe this? Does he really believe that human beings are filled with the forest, become the forest, can become birds, or whatever? And the answer is yes. Does it only, I mean, as he put it, does it only feel that way? Does it only seem to contradict common sense? Or does it in fact? In other words, is this a rhetorical figure for Eisenstein or a fact of nature? So to begin to answer this question, we have to go back to the origins of his ideas in earlier work. Eisenstein didn't always view nature as an active agent. And if we go back to the dialectical approach to film form, a number of transformative works that he wrote in 1929, he represents nature as the quintessential passive organic form, which he contrasts with rational creative forms, with industry and other sort of active forces. But this view would undergo a radical modification over the next few years. And in 1935, 6 years later, after his trip to Europe, the United States, and Mexico, when he's at the conference of filmmakers that was called together to endorse the implementation of socialist realism in cinema, Eisenstein again claimed that art was produced by a dialectics of things like nature and industry, the rational and the non-rational. But this time nature plays a completely different role in that dialectic. It was at this conference that he makes the statement that has often been quoted as an introduction to his later thinking, that the effect of a work of art is based on its appeal to our highest intellectual sense, at the same time appealing to our most primal sensory emotional abilities. He preceded this conclusion and completely irritated his audience with an extended discussion of pre-modern peoples, their ritual and artistic practices, and the ways that they showed how we are essentially dialectical beings. And in this case, he used the example of the unity of opposites within us that makes us capable of understanding ourselves as being two things at once. So both connected to this theory of art, that we can be both intellectual and sensory emotional beings at the same time, but more than that, we can actually be two things at once. And his favorite example, as he explained to his increasingly bewildered and angry audience, was the Bororo people of Brazil. And this is a common example. It comes from famous ethnographic works that Eisenstein was reading from the late 19th century. So the Bororo people of Brazil believed that they were not only human, but also that they were red parrots. And he explained that this wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a dream, it wasn't something that happened in the afterlife. They believed that they were human and red parrots at the same time. The fully sensory emotional state achieved by the Bororo, he said, would seem to contradict common sense, but of course dissolves boundaries between humans and animals, allowed humans to become entirely immersed in a non-human form, transformed into animals, but without losing their human capabilities. So it's this sense of combined sensory emotional and rational intellectual thinking that accounts, according to Eisenstein 1935, that accounts for the effectiveness and the transformative powers of art. So what happened between 1929 and 1935? Well, the first thing that happened is that Eisenstein discovered all this ethnographic reading. He was interested in prehistory, which was a very popular topic among modernist artists. He was interested in prehistory already in Russia before he went to Europe, but then he began reading this ethnographic work, and then he ended up going and spending more than a year in Mexico. And these were two completely transformative experiences for him. I'm definitely not the first person to say that reading works of the so-called primitive cultures and living in Mexico were transformative for him. But the role of nature has really not been addressed in any of this literature. So Eisenstein found, reading Fraser and especially Lucien Lévy-Bruhl about pre-modern and non-industrial peoples gave Eisenstein new ways to expand his thinking about modernity and non-industrial, about modernity and its many opposites. He had already played around with some of these contrasts when he made The Old and the New in regard to Russian peasants and rural society. He was getting ready to do that again in 1935 with Beige Meadow. But in Mexico, he'd had this opportunity to explore a much greater range of experiences, starting with the experience of non-industrial time. Eisenstein saw what Bathsheba Demus says about Beringia, the lands bordering the Bering Strait, in her wonderful new book, Floating Coast. Eisenstein saw in Mexico that, quote, human ways of seeing time mixed with the times of the place itself, the life of animals, and the cycles of the seasons. For Eisenstein, this multiple sense of time was a commingling of the human and the natural. He wrote, wherever you look, the whole country seems to just have risen from the two oceans that wash its shores. Everywhere she seemed to be in a state of coming into being. And that reinforced his developing theory of history, where the past is ever visible in the present, which became one of the major themes of his writing about his films in Mexico and about the Mexican film, which he translated. And then he translated this idea into a kind of visual geographical terms as the image of Mexico today is where the chronological vertical column, right? So from past into present, the chronological vertical column is unfurled like a horizontal fan into the simultaneity of sequential stages of cultural historical eras. So that's a real mouthful, but basically saying, if you look at the map of Mexico, as you travel through Mexico from one place to another, you travel from one time to another as well. You see people living in the past and in the present, and the past and the present are mingled. Both Ann Nesbitt and Masha Salaskin and others who've written about this have seen this unfurled horizontal fan as a kind of flat screen for Eisenstein to project his interior overanalyzed self onto. Mikhail Yampolsky refers to this as solipsistically projecting himself on the landscape. Earlier, that was not in connection with Mexico. And Eisenstein seems to confirm this idea of seeing Mexico as a place where he could project himself onto nature. When he wrote 12 years later, so 12 years later, he writes a manuscript that was intended for method, that was about his experiences in Mexico. And he wrote, the whole complex of characteristic emotions and features growing out of me and spreading in a boundless way became here the whole gigantic country with mountains and forests and cathedrals, people and produce, animals and breaking waves, herds and armies. At our first meeting, I was gripped by the feeling that the reality before me and all of its contradictions was something like an outward projection of all those individual traits and features, a knot of complexes that I carried and still carry around with me. In the same manuscript, though, typically Eisenstein, he suggests the very opposite of projection. The absorption of Mexico into himself, much like Guy de Maupassant dissolved the forest into himself, or ate it, right? And it became himself. And he expands on all the ways that Mexico's variety of contradictions, its austerity and excess, its indigenous and imperial traditions, its tropics and deserts, its factories and jungles, seem to resonate with all the contradictions that he felt within himself. In another passage, he joins this inner resonance with the land itself. And there's a long section here where he talks about the sleeping bodies of bronzed figures of men and women that he's looking down on from above. And here he joins these breathing bodies with the tropics that echoed a drowsy sensuality, with the very earth seemed to be breathing, and these bodies, seem to be embodied in me. So in his usual dialectical way, projection is never separate from absorption and embodiment. Both in his 1931 diary and in texts written for method about Mexico in 1940 and in 1943, Eisenstein conjures up images of what it felt like to spend time in Mexico that all evoke this intense kind of identification. The full employment of all the senses gives a feeling of complete merging and unity with one's surroundings. These affinities also made Eisenstein think that he had a kind of direct line to Mexico, a way of understanding Mexico that most foreigners didn't have. In what is perhaps the most precise distillation of this, he wrote, which is, I think, a riff on Zola. He wrote, "Je ne fais pas de cinéma, je fais du Mexique et du moi." I'm not making a film, I'm making Mexico and myself. Okay, so this dialectic viewed from a post-colonial perspective are examples of what Gayatri Spivak called the domestic subject of imperialism. Eisenstein found himself, right? We know this trope. He found himself through projection of himself onto the land to effect a kind of mastery of the land. And at the same time, he attempts an erasure of that power hierarchy in its mirror opposite, surrender of the self to the land. And Mary Louise Pratt, who also studies European travel writing, 18th century European travel writing and transculturation in her book Imperial Eyes, calls this a form of self-discovery that she calls anti-conquest. In her study of the subjectivity of European travelers in colonial spaces, she finds a lot of travel writing that attempted this same kind of erasure of the distance between the travelers and the objects of their gaze, to efface differences and emphasize similarities in order to hide barriers to understanding or deny barriers to understanding, to assert some kind of mastery. So Eisenstein's combination of projection and absorption, we always think everything about Eisenstein is unique to him, but of course it wasn't. And not only is this not unique to him, but from a post-colonial point of view, is a particularly self-deluding and a kind of malignant kind of colonial gaze. But, so I don't want to dismiss this conclusion. It's actually the subject of another chapter in the new book that I'm writing, but what I want to emphasize here is the way that nature for Eisenstein is the driving force in this affinity that he conjures with Mexico. And that this combination of immersion in nature and absorption of the natural into himself brings us back to the question of whether Eisenstein really believed that people were red parrots, grass, the birds at the top of a tree, or sleeping, breathing bodies that he saw as embodied both in the earth and in himself. And here we need to ask, what kind of logic can make this seemingly impossible seem real or seem worth considering as real? And that question can be answered, I think, by putting it in dialogue with film form, with Eisenstein's position on film form and film sense. And now going back to 1945 to his essay on in Non-Indifferent Nature. So going back to Non-Indifferent Nature, remember that the music of landscape is not just about landscape, but about the fate of Montage counterpoint at a new stage. And he wrote that Potemkin is the recent past of Montage form, of Montage efforts, of Montage quests. In contrast, the new stage of audiovisual montage, I believe, entered with the sign of an increasing fusion and harmony of montage and polyphony. We're standing at the threshold now of a third phase of the history of montage. First was undifferentiation, prehistorical montage. There he's talking about prehistoric, pre-modern peoples. And then came greater separation of separate elements, banging their heads together in montage. And now we're in a new stage of increasing fusion and harmony of montage and polyphony. And that's what the rest of this essay is about. The previous discussion of a vast array of artworks from all over the world leads him to say that he's shown the music of landscape has grown beyond the frame of music. If landscape, that is the ability to carry emotion in its nonverbal musical forms, into the problems of music of each plastic construction of the shot in general. And here he's talking about things he's discussed like action, object, space, event, landscape, all those things being visible at once, or like the fluid and the solid, the material and the airy, close and what's distance. These are all different ways he's talking about. Okay, that wasn't me.
So sorry about that. Yeah, I have taken away people's ability to unmute themselves.
Okay.
I'm removing that person from the event.
Okay, that was violent collision montage, right? Okay. So a lot of this essay is about all the different ways in which within a single shot or combining shots across the length of a movie, as he does in Ivan the Terrible, there's what he calls polyphonic multipoint or synesthetic montage, which is not just the bringing together of two things, but the bringing together of multiple things, creating networks of images and meaning that immerse the viewer while at the same time making the viewer aware of, while the viewer is still aware of multiple things going on at once. But what I want to emphasize here is that this is not the end, this is not the rejection of a kind of binary montage. It's the incorporation of binary montage into polyphonic montage. So all of those multi-points or elements of any shot, or elements of a shot that combine in one shot or that combine across a sequence of shots that are connected, are connections of binary montage units. So things like fluid and solid, material and airy, what's close and what's distant, these are all combined in that much broader sort of synesthetic and polyphonic montages. I hope that's relatively clear. And here, let me try and make it clearer by saying that I found the literature on immersion in video games to be really useful in explaining what Eisenstein's thinking about at this point. So scholars of new media identify one kind of immersive experience in response to what are called ergodic systems. That is, video game systems, right? These are immersive, the viewer feels a kind of immersive absorption in systems that allows for sensory awareness of multiple points in a given space, like a video game or a text. So I don't know how many of you play video games, but you all probably can imagine the way of how immersive they are because they're incredibly successful. People become immersed in the narratives of these games while being aware of the scene that they're traveling through, right? And being aware of all sorts of things like, as in a film, right? At any given moment. The viewer is absorbed by multiple disparate elements in a film frame, lighting, composition, camera work, acting, sound, and so on, which all combine to stimulate our senses and create new networks of meaning. Analogously, this kind of ergodic immersion also provides a model for understanding how Eisenstein's sense of polyphonic montage can be based on immersion in nature and this idea that people can be red parrots and people at the same time. Because that's what this ergodic immersion is about. It's about being immersed in a system while still being immersed in a very complex system while still being aware of that complexity and being able to travel between these two spaces at the same time. So yes, the Bororo people of Brazil can be red parrots and still know that they are human beings at the same time. George Sand can be flying with the sparrows and truly feel like she's flying and still know that she's not a sparrow. To take a more closer example, Ivan the Terrible, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible can be a traumatized and abandoned child and a ruthless murderer. And we can sympathize, we as viewers can sympathize and condemn him at the same time. And we can feel confused about that and clear about that at the same time. Eisenstein argues that this kind of dual consciousness, immersed and aware, is a necessary ingredient in great art. The magic of immersion in nature for him is immersion as a form of connection across species and natural forms and a liberation from the constraints of reason, which makes it the diametrical opposite of the kind of immersion that Anne Eakin-Moss shows in her great article in Screen that she shows was a central feature of socialist realist cinema. But is usually a force not for transformation and insight and liberation, but for control and repression. And this comparison brings us around to the politics of immersion, but it's really a sort of a long section. I'd be happy to talk about it generally if someone wants me to, but I think that's enough, and I think I'll stop here and open this up to questions. And finish sharing my screen, right? And come back. Hi.
All right, Joan, thank you so much. Lots going on, and some nice reactions already from people doing their reaction sites. There's tons here for anyone who is a fan of Eisenstein and also the work you've already shared in the years past. So I can do two things. I am, as the host, going to monitor the chat, but I'm also going to look at a list of participants. And so there are two ways people can either signal in the chat that you want to ask a question, or you can put up your hand on the participants list and I will find a spot for you. Well, people warm up to do that. I'm just going to start by asking my own question from the notes about all of this, which is, this works so well, and this is a side of Eisenstein I've never thought about, which is terrific. I guess I just wonder if you feel comfortable riffing a little bit more on, as in a kind of just an extension of what you've already said, on the kind of philosophy that he was producing of this, right? Because it seems that we could go in so many ways. I mean, not necessarily even to Mexico, but to the East Asian kind of Buddhist tradition that he read so much about through his work on Japanese and hieroglyphs and so forth. To dissolve into nothing, which gives birth to everything, we could just kind of stop there, right? And say it was an East Asian thing. We don't need Mexico. And yet at the same time, it seems a profoundly kind of 20th century thing, not even just a Soviet thing, to say that people who have a capacity for morphing is the ultimate modernist quest, not least in a Soviet state, which is about collectivity and synesthesia of a certain kind of a grand calling, right? But is it the case? I mean, I guess this is just a simple way of rewording what you've already said. Is it necessary to try and locate it in a Soviet setting? Is that too clunky, which I think it is? Or is it really just that you're saying that he had this rather rich philosophy that he took from people like Levi Brühl and others and moved on from there? That this was kind of a personal philosophy that he wanted to share, and that film would be a dimension of this kind of more morphing. Is it a film theory thing? Is it a Soviet thing? Is it an East Asia thing? I've got all three in my head. Does it matter? I will stop.
Right. Okay. So it's all of those things. It's all of those things, right? Eisenstein was a voracious reader, and everything that he wrote referred to enormous numbers of artists and thinkers and other people. So there are two ways to answer that. One is if we want to know more about Eisenstein, then we need to know something about all the people that he was referring to. So non-indifferent nature, like on just 20 pages, I think I found like 100 references. I counted this up once. He is constantly he's constantly drawing on the thoughts of other artists and the work of other artists. So today I focus on Mexico because that's one of the areas that I think his work on nature hasn't been appreciated in. But this chapter also includes a long section on Chinese landscape painting. And so for him, the idea is to, he was always looking to find ways, he was always looking to find affinities between people across cultures and across time. So yeah, if we want to understand Eisenstein, we need to know everything about everyone that he's talking about and to try and understand those affinities. If we want to know more about Soviet culture at the time, then I think I need to turn to other people who are doing work like Anne, who I mentioned at the very end, and other film scholars and cultural scholars who are working on formalism in particular, which I'm not at all a specialist in. Eisenstein drew on literally everybody. So if we want to understand what he was contributing to Soviet cultural history, then that's a different way to turn, right? Yeah, did that answer your question? I could talk about Chinese landscape if anybody wants.
No, it's partly all of the above, but I'm going to restrain myself on the early ethnography stuff, and I'm going to defer to at least 3 people on the chat who have posed questions. We are going to take them in order, and we're starting with Maria Sidorkina with a nod to Austin for having made such a great hire. I was really thrilled.
Yes,
Maria, please.
We are too. Hi, Maria.
Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly?
I just wanted to follow up on your offer to speak more about the politics. I'm curious. I want to hear.
Okay, well, let me try and summarize then, okay? There are 2 sections at the end of this long essay. The first one, Eisenstein looks at a number of artists who he claimed were failures. People who we don't normally associate with the concept of failure: Picasso, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, people like that. Picasso Picasso seems to capture exactly the kind of dialectical combinations that Eisenstein favors. And he does a little analysis of Picasso's bullfights, which merge man and beast and so on, and also viewers and the spectacle and so on. And Picasso had nothing but the best leftist political credentials. He was a member of the Communist Party. He was fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was in the resistance during World War II and so on. But Picasso claimed that he kept politics separate from art. And Eisenstein says that makes his work merely art and not really able to take us to somewhere new as human beings. And he does the same sort of riff with Tolstoy. Tolstoy, of course, has none of the right political credentials, but he's really good at stories about things like the death that gives life to birth. Death that gives birth to life. And he gives examples of this, but he says that, as sublime as Tolstoy's writing is, he was living in a time that was not conducive to a new kind of political collective, which was the goal. So that's sort of the first part of the political. He's arguing that art can never be separated from politics. And if you remember, I said that he is right in the middle of finishing Ivan the Terrible Part 2. And I think this was him thinking through the idea of the politics of his own art. But then he goes on to talk about, well, if Tolstoy was living in a culture that could not cultivate great art, right? Or, great art because it was impossible to have the right politics. There were only 3 countries in the world where that was possible: the United States, the Soviet Union, and Mexico. And he dispatches with the United States and the Soviet Union really quickly. So you get the idea then in Eisenstein's writing, these are often rhetorical sort of points that he's making, not necessarily historical points or not necessarily historically accurate points. But okay, so the US and the USSR, he dispatches with very quickly with some cliches about modernization, because he doesn't come out and say this, but he shows that they're moving in one direction and leaving the past behind. It's only Mexico where the past is still present in the present, which he found, just the perfect representation of his own thinking of history and his own thinking about how great culture is, the sort of dialectical basis of his thinking about great culture. And also because of Mexico's landscape, which here I think is just a kind of Orientalist trope about the tropics, right? The tropics are kind of always growing and moving. You can practically see the landscape growing before your eyes. So in Mexico, it's possible to create the environment in which an artist could really create the next stage of art. But before he gets too carried away, it's really important to point out that he ends by saying, this is all a little bit fanciful. And just as we get too carried away with this sort of perfect utopian collectivity and the environment most conducive to individual as well as collective development, he says, this doesn't last, right? This is just an ephemeral kind of temporary state, just as all dialectics create a kind of synthesis and an out-of-body ecstatic experience, but then fragment into new dialectics and new problems and so on. So that's kind of the quick riff on the politics. I think what he's saying is that he has a kind of utopian socialist ideology that is not, that is not like Stalinist socialism, and that he thinks that there is that he has a kind of utopian ideology, and also that art is not great art without some political sense, right? That's my argument.
Please. This is such great material between personal philosophy and political theory, and we don't want to hijack the guy, but it's great. It's great reasoning. The next question up is Sergei Bogatyryov, who's possibly joining us from London. Sergei, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely. I'll put my video off because my signal is a bit weak. My question is also about Eisenstein's, the Soviet context of his work and ideas, but not necessarily political, rather than philosophical, because I was a bit struggling throughout your talk how to contextualize Eisenstein. Then when it came to these final ideas about his montage, I thought, well, that was purely dialectical interpretation. You have sort of clearly 3 stages: stable, negatively rational, positively rational. So it's very much straightforward dialectic interpretation for me. And I was wondering, what was the role of Marxism in Eisenstein's view of nature?
Okay, so that's a huge topic. as far as I know, he read and he cites Engels' Dialectics of Nature. I don't think that he read Marx on nature, because I don't know if it was even available yet when he was reading. Okay, I don't have a full answer for you, Sergey, but the short answer is that you're absolutely right, that he saw history in terms of this sort of primitive communism, and then everything that comes between, the sort of antithesis of that, and then superior communism afterwards. This was not something that existed now, but was something that would come, could be affected in the future, right? Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you.
It's a pretty
beyond that, because I'm not entirely sure that there was that much more influence. There
are also many natures in Marx. There's human nature, there's nature. That's a tough one.
Right.
We have a terrific question from Amanda Casco, who's written it out on the chat, but Amanda, you might like to unmute yourself and pose it.
Yes, hello. So while you were giving your lovely presentation, thank you so much. Something that I was thinking about was, what about the urban landscape and its implication with the human psyche, but also, you know, I suppose, like, when I was seeing the photos too, like, there's like, there are like these buildings that are there, right? And so this question that, you know, what are the implications for the human interaction with urban landscape along with nature? Is there a merging there too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, absolutely, he writes about that too. I mean, here I wanted to be more focused on the natural landscape, because rather than the built landscape. For him, the built landscape was also capable of creating a process, an experience of immersion, but it could never be quite as complete because it was never quite as complete, right? Because that's not actually true. So there are two different ways that he writes about the urban landscape and the built landscape. Sometimes he writes about the urban landscape as replicating the natural landscape, and other times he writes about it as being too focused on this sort of forward movement, right? Too much a replica or a representation of the future without a past. But otherwise, yeah, and he writes about the urban landscape in New York, creating this kind of experience for him, like sort of disorienting as well as immersive experience at the same time. Good question.
I'm a fan of Amanda's question, only because we don't, Maria was earlier asking who Eisenstein might have been reading, and we don't know if he was reading Louis Aragon, The Peasant of Paris, or Walter Benjamin, or what have you, but there are lots of fans of animism in urban worlds as well, and there's no reason why Eisenstein couldn't be extended to urban worlds just as easily, though it's not as beautiful as the way you've set it up. Amanda, do you want to follow up with your question that you just posted on the chat?
Yes, sorry, thank you. I was wondering what specific works of his where he talks about the urban landscape, specifically New York City.
In Montage, in the Montage essays, and also, I'm trying to think. In some of the work in Method, where he is talking about in Method, yeah, in some of the work in Method as well.
How else are we doing for questions, either in the chat or in the or by people raising their hands? Any other comments? Maria Vinogradova, please.
Hi, Maria.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful talk, Joan. I really appreciate your work on late Eisenstein and the point you're making about his evolution that is often forgotten. And I mean, there are lots of things to talk about here, but I have been especially interested in the concept of harmony. So you said that.
I'm sorry, what?
In harmony. So you said that. During these later years, Eisenstein was evolving towards a more harmonious concept of montage. So what is harmonious montage? Is it the cinema of long takes? Is Eisenstein becoming Bazin? I would like to hear about that, please.
No, it's not necessarily to have long takes to have harmonious or immersive or polyphonic or synesthetic montage. So he's thinking about the ways in which elements within it, both within a single, elements within a single shot can merge in producing an effect on the viewer. That doesn't have to be there doesn't have to be something as striking as like, slaughtering a bull and showing an attack on the workers to have that kind of dialectical effect, right? To have an effect where two things come together and create a third thing, or five things come together and create something new. So that can be both within the shot, but it can also be, and we really see this in Ivan the Terrible, which he talks about in Non-Indifferent Nature, and it is in some detail, where we see elements of individual shots connecting with other elements in individual shots later on and creating networks of meaning. Yuri Tsigan calls this distant montage. It creates networks of meaning which don't necessarily include elements or anything colliding with each other, but evoking each other, evoking themselves again later on. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Yes. I guess you're muted.
It's a little tricky to get unmuted. Yes, it makes perfect sense, but I'm really glad you brought this up. Thank you.
And just in follow-up to Amanda's earlier question, we have a kind volunteering from Ken Eisenstein, presumably no relation, on the chat about some of the writings about urban landscape. The next question up is from Anne Moss, please. Great.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm sorry I wore the same blouse as you. That was. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Now? Okay.
Things are good.
Okay. That was amazingly clarifying and wonderful, Joan. I'm so glad to get this introduction to this part of the book. I think I had a version of the historian's question that you proposed before, which was, to what extent does Eisenstein really believe this happens? But it's not exactly just, to what extent is it happen, but on what level is it happening, right? Is it happening between himself and the Mexican landscape? Is it happening at the moment of the filming? Or is it, to what extent does it happen at the moment of capturing the image with the camera? And to what extent does it happen after the projection, the editing montage? So how does how is he imagining that technological mediation, takes us into nature? And how much can you just do it in your experience of, this colonial landscape too?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I understand it is that Eisenstein looked at all these experiences that he read about and thought that this was what he was trying to get at in drawing people in creating a meaningful experience in cinema. So, so his goal was to recreate that experience for the viewer. Well, first of all, yes, his goal was to recreate that experience for the viewer, and then also to tear it apart to try and understand it and to write about it. So where does it happen? I think that's a great way of putting it. It happens in the world, right? It happens in the past, it happens in the present. And it also, and then and then the way it happens in film is through this combination of, you know, multi-point binary montage elements, right, that combine to create an individual, every individual shot, but also then all the connections between the shots. And that recreates this kind of ergodic, you know, kind of immersion where you can be completely immersed, but still have an experience of yourself as a person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
That's a great way of putting it. I mean, I've been struggling with that, obviously, because to me, I don't have any trouble believing that people think they're the grass or parrots or birds or whatever. Like, that just seems sort of normal to me, but not to most people, it turns out. At least when I give these talks, someone always comes up and asks me, did he really believe that? And I'm like, yes, and I do too. But trying to understand what this means for him, you know, what role this plays for him. I think you put it really well, sort of where does that happen?
Great, please. We have an excellent question coming up next from that's on the chat, but I will invite Yulia Alexeyeva to share it. If Yulia, you are with us.
Yes, hi, sorry. My connection might not be so great. Hi, good to see you. And I really loved your talk. Thank you so much. I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse here, so I apologize if this is totally out of field, but hearing you talk about the conceptions of nature, and by the way, I am completely with you on the everyone can be parrots, and so I'm 100%, I buy it. But I am curious about how his theories relate to theories of the sublime, because that's kind of what, and I apologize if you had already mentioned it, but it does seem to be heavily kind of informed by this type of like early 19th century thinking that then almost like a communist sublime in a way. And I've been thinking about sort of these questions too, so I'd be curious to know if these connections actually exist. So thanks.
So I'm afraid I don't really have an answer for you. It's clear, what I can say is that it's clear that he was interested in the kind of romantic ideas, you know, the romantics ideas about nature. But this really takes me out of my wheelhouse, because that's, you know, like a literary category that I haven't studied yet. It's on my list of things, right, to bring in, but I actually don't really have an answer. There may be other people, other Eisenstein people who are here who know that better than I do, but I don't know the answer to that. But thank you for asking.
The sublime takes us back to the political theory of earlier, where Maria started us as well. So let's see how we're doing. We have, I think we have most of the questions on the run. I'm just going to take a look at the list again for a second. Okay. If no one is coming in, Joan, I always want to make sure we get a chance to not just give you the last word, but also remember that I think it's already evident here, there's lots of love on the screen, Joan. There's a lot of people rooting for you, not just because they know your work really well, but because it's a great topic and you've already identified the ways in which it can go. I always love asking people just at the end, are there things that you didn't want to put in the talk because you haven't sorted out yet, that you want us not necessarily to think with you on the spot, but to think with you as some of us in New York City, your home and native land, will be on the subway periodically. And while I'm staring at a subway ceiling sometime next week, are there things you still want us to be thinking with that you think are still the unresolved parts of this whole project? I know it's a larger book project, and what can we do to help you make it better over the next few weeks?
Well, gosh, as I was writing this, I had all sorts of things that I don't know the answer to that I wanted help with, but you know, now I can't think of them.
You don't have to.
I know that there is a lot of nature writing that I don't know about, because it's such a huge topic. So if there, and especially with all the writing on the Anthropocene and environmental history, it's just, I mean, it's a huge topic, and I want to be able to put it in that context. The other thing that I really am weak on, aside from, you know, Marxism and the sublime, which I didn't really answer, is sort of socialist, besides Anne's work on immersion, is Soviet intellectual history of this period, and where Eisenstein fits in, because this is stuff that, you know, Eisenstein's big, right? And I have to start with his text, and then I can sort of spread out and think about other things. So the larger project is looking at immersion in Eisenstein's thinking in terms of cinema and his newer theories, his newer film theory, and politics. Well, that's the other thing. So the other thing that I really need to work on, the literature of, has to do with the individual and the collective in Soviet history. And there's a lot of new literature on individualism and subjectivity under in late Stalinism, but also in late Soviet history. And I know in some ways anthropologists are way ahead of historians in the sense that they're already working a lot on late Soviet history, and I know that there's some really useful work there as well. So, yeah. Okay. So the other thing that I'm really interested in is the Eisenstein read, as I said, Eisenstein was a voracious reader. He owned like 6,000 books or something like that, which is just like amazing. And he corresponded with people all over the world. He very much was, both saw himself and I think actually was a very cosmopolitan thinker. And everyone who studies Eisenstein knows this, but I don't think that we've really, aside from just sort of talking about the people that he writes about, I don't think we've really explored what that means, what it meant to be such a, I mean, of course, you know, Katie Clark has written about this, but I don't know for Eisenstein if we really know what it means to have been a really cosmopolitan thinker, an international thinker, a transnational thinker in the 1930s and 40s. And so that's one of the other questions I have, if other people have any ideas about that.
Okay. That's just the list that I think that most of us wanted. We don't, there's no more questions coming up on the chat.
Okay.
So Joan, what I most want to do is just speak on behalf of what I think are quite a number of others who are expressing their own pleasure on in written form here in the sidebar. This was a terrific talk. It's great to see you. It's a wonderful project, and thank you so much for joining us today. And to everyone near and far, we don't normally get to collect people from around the globe, and so thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce. Thank everybody here for inviting me to come and give this talk. And really, thank you. I just wish that we could all go out drinking now, even though it's only like 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.